Before I get into it, I have so many questions for you. Would you just give us a little bit like, what's your background? How are you an authority on this? How'd you get into doing this?
Yeah, sure. So, I have a PhD in nutrition science. My dissertation work. So, what I did throughout grad school was worked on the prevention of chronic disease. So, I mean, it's really like right, right in the same exact scope of MAHA. And I was really focused on like strategies like diet, lifestyle strategies to reduce risk of cardiometabolic disease, which is like diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So that was my research focus. And I'm also a registered dietitian. So I'm also an RD, which I did after my PhD, which is kind of a weird route. But so yeah, that's my background. I worked at the University of Nevada for a couple years in academia before transitioning out, and I have been working kind of part time with a microbiome company since then.
That's all?
Yeah.
Yeah, in addition to making content day and night. So, yeah,
Yes, yes.
the life of a
This
creator.
this little side hustle, I suppose.
So, I want to take you through some of the specific claims that RFK makes and then get to the larger picture. And I just want to say to anybody watching, we're coming to this with an open mind. If he's saying things that are science backed, I want to hear it. If he's not saying things that are science backed, we want to hear that too. And we want to know what'll keep us healthy. So, my first question is that RFK has consistently said that the food industry, and this is a quote, is mass poisoning the American public. President Trump says that Americans have been crushed by the industrial food complex. So, I guess big picture is the overall MAHA movement, the Make America Healthy Again movement, um, based on something real? Like, is our food supply making us sick? And could it be reformed to make us healthier?
Yeah, yes, I absolutely think that our food supply needs to be improved. We have a food system that is predominantly what we term ultra processed foods, which in the literature there's a specific meaning for that, which is it contains like a food or processing method that you don't have access to, right? So I mean, there's the so what we have now is a food system that is predominantly these ultra processed foods. Now, not all ultra processed foods are bad, which I think that gets lost, but a lot of them are these high sugar, high fat, high sodium, nutrient devoid ultra processed foods, right? Packaged foods that can travel far because we kind of don't have a lot of local food systems anymore. And so I do think there's a lot of truth to the idea that our food system needs improvement. Where I digress with the idea of like poisoning the American people is this idea that it's a lack of scientific integrity and we're just allowing these poisonous additives into our food supply. It's a lot more nuanced than that. I mean, if you look at what Americans are consuming, over 90% of Americans don't meet vegetable and fiber intake guidelines. Over 50% of Americans are eating too much added sugar. 70% of Americans are eating more calories than are needed for what they need.
Wow.
And you compare that, and then you combine that with 80% of Americans aren't meeting physical activity guidelines, right? So you have this kind of like environment where we're not meeting these nutrition guidelines, and so it's a little bit different than just like these food additives that we're all so much focused on.
I mean, some of this seems like common sense. Like we kind of know
Yeah.
what is and isn't healthy, but let's get into some specifics. One of the things that Kennedy's really beating the drum on right now are seed oils. And I didn't even know that was a category of oil until recently.
I
If it
didn't
even.
either, Jessica.
And he says that it's a way that Americans are unknowingly being poisoned. Um, and he also said that beef tallow is more healthy than seed oils. So, can you give us like the primer? What are seed oils? Is that a real category? Are they dangerous? And how do they compare to beef tallow?
Yeah, so when I kind of said in jest, neither did I. It's because in nutrition research and nutrition science, we don't use that term seed oils. That's really a wellness influencer online term that has been used. We use like vegetable oils, polyunsaturated fatty acids, or the individual oil. We'll talk about canola oil or safflower oil, sunflower oil. And I mean, this is just the seed oil. And we'll talk about like artificial dyes and things like that, where there's more nuance. But this particular topic with seed oils just literally flies in the face of nutrition science research. I mean, polyunsaturated fatty acids, there's an immense amount, decades worth of data to show that it is more cardioprotective than saturated fats. And when you replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats on a kind of like population level, you see better health outcomes.
Wait, so help
Yeah.
me 1 second. Seed oils, which is a seed oil? It's
A seed
canola.
Seed oil is like canola, which is rapeseed in other countries, safflower, sunflower, those types of polyunsaturated. If you get vegetable oils, those are predominantly seed oils that are in
Okay.
that vegetable
And
oil.
those are polyunsaturated. And
Those are
you're saying they have
polyunsaturated.
heart protective qualities? Or you
The
said, yeah.
Yes, that's what the evidence has shown for decades, that there's heart protective qualities of seed oils. Now here's the nuance with seed oils. Seed oils are very cheap. The extraction method is very cheap, and they're very flavorless. They don't have strong flavors like olive oil and these other oils. And so, because of that, food corporations use them in the vast majority of their ultra processed foods. So, what is happening is we're over consuming seed oils. We're over consuming these
Mhm.
polyunsaturated fatty acids because we're over consuming these ultra processed foods. And the overconsumption of anything can be problematic, right? The overconsumption of sugar, the overconsumption of fats, the overconsumption of water is problematic. And so when we talk about seed oils, I mean, even if you look around the world at some of the healthiest populations, they're consuming seed oils. I hear a lot from people talking about like Japan and how healthy Japan is. I mean, Japan, the number one oil that they use is canola oil. So it's not that the seed oils themselves are problematic to health. Like there's just not evidence to show that. But overconsumption of them absolutely can be problematic to health. And in our environment in the US, we do tend to overconsume polyunsaturated fatty acids.
And for folks who are cooking at home, like what's a way to ensure that you don't overconsume polyunsaturated fats? Do you just change up the kind of oil you use?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're already avoiding a lot of ultra processed foods, you're not consuming as many, right?
Okay.
Because again, they're in those like packaged foods. But yeah, you can switch up oils. You can use olive oil, avocado oil. Seed oils are fine also to like pan fry in.
Right.
Butter, just a variety is actually like probably more beneficial than
This
than
is
sticking
always
to
the
one
rule.
thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everything in moderation. Okay, and quickly, what is beef tallow and is that good for you? I mean, I kind of know.
Beef tallow is, I mean, the fat of cattle. It's like the organ fat, like the fat that comes from around like the organs, like the liver and things. So it's like lard, right? But so it's no, it's there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that there's no evidence to suggest that swapping out seed oils and putting in beef tallow is beneficial to health.
It also seems like it might be very high in cholesterol, beef
Yeah.
tallow. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I
I
mean, and
mean,
saturated fats are known to increase LDL cholesterol and increase risk of heart disease. So, at a population level, again, there's going to be variability depending on who you are as an individual. But on a population level, if we're swapping all the seed oils for beef tallow, we're going to end up with even more problems with heart disease. That would be like the major hypothesis of nutrition scientists.
great. And it means more killing of cows, which is whatever. Okay. Artificial dyes. Let's move on to the next category. So, our health secretary, RFK Jr., says he wants to get rid of artificial dyes by the time he's done with his term at HHS. I guess he recently sat down with the CEOs of some major food companies to lay out this agenda. I got a couple of questions for you on this front. We all know that, I mean, a lot of us, if we're online, know that during the campaign, there was this big show and tell where a bunch of influencers went to Capitol Hill and they held up boxes of cereal and said that there's artificial dyes in this and that they're terrible for you. Um, a lot of folks, including RFK, claim that food dyes cause cancer and ADHD in children. So, my two questions: is there evidence to prove that food dyes cause cancer and ADHD? And in general, do you think it's better to get rid of all food dyes, artificial food dyes from our food supply?
So, is there evidence to show that food dye causes cancer in humans? No, no evidence to show that. The red dye 3 we had talked about, I think, which just got banned for cancer. That was because there were some studies in the 80s that came out. I think two studies in the 80s that showed that very high. What gets lost with this? I'm going to cut myself off. What gets lost is we never talk about dose when we're talking about these things. And so, what those studies showed was that very high doses of red dye 3 in rats caused tumor growth. And this was, again, these were studies in the 80s, through a mechanism that most scientists don't think that is applies to humans, right? So to a mechanism that doesn't apply to humans in way larger doses, it was some sort of high percentage of their body weight in red dye 3 that we would never be exposed to. So because we have something called the Delaney clause, which is that anything that causes cancer in any dose in any model, so whether that be animal or human, it needs to be removed from the food supply. And so that was why the FDA recently banned red dye 3. It was a legal requirement, but there's no evidence that any of those dyes have ever caused cancer in humans. We don't have that evidence. In terms of ADHD, there's also no evidence to suggest that it causes ADHD. Certainly not. But there is some evidence to show some correlational evidence to show that that some dyes, some of these azo dyes, can exacerbate symptoms of ADHD in children with ADHD, in the small subset of children with ADHD. What's difficult about that research is it's hard to kind of tease out, is it the dyes specifically, or is it the food, which usually it's like high sugar, ultra processed
Mm,
foods. And so when you eliminate the dyes, you're eliminating those high sugar, ultra processed foods. Is it like the environment where they're consuming them? Because a lot of times it's at birthday parties or out with friends or whatever like that. And so like when
yeah.
you eliminate them, you're eliminating those opportunities. So it is hard to tease out, but right now there is a little bit of evidence to suggest, and just anecdotally, I do hear from people both things. I hear that removing dyes does nothing, and then some people do find that removing dyes does help symptoms, but it certainly doesn't cause ADHD.
I want to just underscore for people watching something you just did. And this is why I trust you and what I think is important for people to look for, which is you just acknowledged what the hard science shows, but then also allowed that there's this category of correlational evidence, which is the science can't prove it yet, but we are seeing a thing in kids that we want to acknowledge and requires more investigation and study, and we should be aware of for now. So,
Yes.
to everybody paying attention to this is the kind of smart approach you want and the people giving you health advice, which is they're flexible enough to first point out the science and then tell you, here's what science hasn't captured, but we're acknowledging your reality and investigating it. And then that gives me the faith that when Jessica says, and there's no backing for this and there's no evidence for this, that she really means it, that it's not like she's ignoring your reality or pretending your reality isn't real. So, this area of correlational evidence is super valuable and a great way for parents to understand they're being heard. Um, so, I'm curious, based on what you said, do you think it would be wise, or what do you think should be done about artificial dyes in general? Like, should we take them out just to be safe? Do they need more investigation?
I mean, listen, I'm not like pro food dye. So I I recommend, as a dietitian, as somebody with a PhD in nutrition, that we avoid for the most part a lot of these foods that have these artificial food dyes anyway, because they're like high sugar, nutrient devoid foods, right? I think if you eat them sparingly, it's not a problem for the vast majority of people. And it's certainly not the problem that like this movement is making them out to be. I do think though that, there's some like movements to remove them from schools and things. I think that they are a marketing tool for companies more than anything else. Children are drawn to these really bright colors, and so that's why they use them for the most part. And we can, and we can get into the weeds on this because there are some issues with some of these natural dyes too. And so there are some benefits to using these artificial dyes. But overall, I would not like stop anyone from wanting to remove dyes from
Right.
food. I just want a nuanced, honest conversation about why we're doing that. Not that they're poisoning us just because, we want the children to eat less of these types of foods and they're a good marketing tool for the kids, that sort of thing.
Right. It's more marketing than any value, inherent
Yeah.
value. Let's talk about high fructose corn syrup. So, I mean, I know enough about food to know I'm not supposed to eat a lot of it, but RFK says it's just a formula for making you obese and diabetic. What do you say to that?
High fructose corn syrup is so sugar, table sugar is sucrose. It's 50% glucose, 50% fructose. High fructose corn syrup is 55% fructose, 45% glucose. So it's it's a variation of 5%. So it's 5% higher of fructose. We use it because we heavily subsidize corn in this country. And there's a whole history here too, by the way, going back to like the Reagan era of how high fructose corn syrup became such a big thing in our country versus sucrose or cane sugar. But we use it because it's cheap. It's a cheap sugar source versus sucrose. And so it's also used in a lot of these ultra processed foods. So in terms of it's any worse than sucrose, I mean it's indistinguishable essentially in your body. I mean I ran so many OGTTs in the lab, and a lot of my research was on sugar metabolism,
What's
and
an
I mean
OGTT?
sorry, oral glucose tolerance tests.
Okay.
And I mean the variability when you look at it in a human model, when you're just like consuming things, it's just there's not a big difference between high fructose corn syrup and table sugar in terms of the metabolic impact on it. Why it's a problem is because we overconsume high fructose corn syrup. The overconsumption of any kind of sugar can be an issue. And because we use it, because it's cheap in all these ultra processed foods, it can be problematic for us. But there's nothing like uniquely bad about it, essentially, for our health.
Okay. Well, I will come back to talking about what we grow and subsidize. Well, why don't we just talk about that right now because
Sure.
we're here? So, one of the things the US government subsidizes, some of the crops, are corn, soybeans, and wheat. For folks who don't know, that means we pay farmers in the US who grow these crops. And that, as you say, makes them artificially cheap. And since they're so cheap, they get used in a lot of foods, processed foods, and we might overuse them. RFK says that our subsidy program, this is a quote, is so backward that less than 2% of farm subsidies go to fruits and vegetables. Does he have a good point, and should that change if it's true?
Yeah, if he said that, he has a great point. I say the same thing. Yes, our subsidy program is a little bit backwards. Our dietary guidelines tell people to make half their plate fruits and vegetables. So that's like one of our guidelines to live a healthful life and eat a healthful diet. Make half your plate fruits and vegetables. But our subsidies for crops are in the direct opposition of that, right? Less than one. I think it's less than 1% of our crop subsidies go towards fruits and vegetables. And so yes, and the problem is the vast majority of them go to corn, wheat, and soy, and that doesn't even all go to human feed. A lot of that is for animal agriculture and fuel. Like 40% of our corn goes to fuel. And so we have this like system where we're growing our crops, not necessarily for the health of our population. And it would be very helpful to change that and put a little bit more subsidies into these fruits and vegetables and bring down the cost of some of this produce, which tends to be higher. I mean, berries, the cost of berries are quite high. But yeah, so bringing down some of the cost for the fruits and vegetables that we grow here, and then modifying that a little bit. Because what happens is the crops that are subsidized, corn, wheat, and soy, that do go to animal feed. That's kind of the wrong term. Animal food, or I'm sorry, human food is it goes to ultra processed foods. I mean, that's the base of ultra processed foods, right? The
So
corn.
basically, we're subsidizing farmers to grow the stuff that's least healthy for us,
Correct.
and
Yes.
we should shift that. I'll double check that that's an RFK quote.
Yeah.
So you sounded skeptical. Maybe,
I just haven't heard him say that directly, but yeah, if he
okay,
did, I agree.
I'll check it out. Um, I also think with tariffs coming on so many fruits and vegetables, this could be a good time to shift how we support farmers in this
Yeah.
country as well. Okay, sorry, did you have another point
I
on
was just gonna
this?
say we also, and this is a whole another thing, but we also need to support our smaller farmers and local agriculture to bring local agriculture back to these locations, which can really help decrease. We have a lot of food deserts in this country, and that can really help if we can create and grow these like local food systems versus relying on these giant agribusiness and these which has exacerbated food deserts and makes us really heavily reliant on this ultra processed packaged food that can travel far because we don't have local food systems like we used to have.
Right, and if we support local farmers, that helps people in cities get more access to non-processed foods and to other food deserts get access to not ultra-processed foods. Maybe what we need are victory gardens.
I don't even know what those are.
Oh, that was during the war when people used to grow their own food in their backyard.
Oh, yeah, we do need those.
Right? We can do that in another conversation. Okay. The next Kennedy question. He has argued that there is a loophole in US law or regulations that allow new ingredients and chemicals to be introduced to our food supply without known safety data or notification to the public. I think that the term, the lingo, is something called GRAS. It's substances generally recognized as safe, GRAS. But his main point is like, we're letting these major food producers just throw extra ingredients in, and we haven't even tested them, or we don't know what they do to the human body. And this needs to stop. Is that true?
Yeah, so he's talking about the GRAS system. So I actually just wrote a newsletter on this on Monday, but the GRAS system is generally recognized as safe. I'll give you a very brief history. So back in 1958, we established this system because more food additives were coming in, and the FDA took oversight of all the food, everything that was going to go into the food. And so they had to go through this lengthy process to get those food additives essentially like passed through so that we could start using them. And so what they did was they created this kind of subcategory called grass, or generally recognized as safe. And initially, it was a really good idea because it was for products like salt and vinegar and baking soda, right? Like things that are generally recognized as safe, that we've been consuming for years and years. And so they could have their own category and they didn't have to go through this lengthy process. And so as kind of we went on in time, when companies would want to introduce a new food ingredient, they could go through this GRAS system, and so they'd have to go through FDA approval and everything, and then it would be generally recognized as safe. And that went on until 1997. So in 1997, in the Clinton administration, there was this really like big push in the 80s and 90s for this deregulation,
Yeah.
and so because of that, the FDA was really backed up too. Like it took a really long time to get these food additives kind of approved. And so because there were so many new food additives and corporations wanted to be using all these food additives, but they'd have to wait a really long time for them to get approved, the FDA changed the way that they did GRAS. And so what they did was they said, okay, we don't have the resources because they were understaffed and under-resourced. So they said, we don't have the resources to look at all of these. So what we're going to do is do a self-affirmation GRAS system where corporations can self-affirm that they're generally recognized as safe. Now that doesn't just mean that they get to say they're safe and not go through anything. They still had to go through kind of the same process that the FDA would go through, but they could use their like own independent panels of scientists to go through the
Ah,
research and say, is the research safe? Now, overall, like the idea there, right? If you're taking if you the most generous interpretation of that is that corporations don't want to be putting unsafe ingredients in their food, right? Because that's going to obviously be problematic to them on the back end. And so they want to ensure that like their food is safe. Obviously, the less generous interpretation is they would expedite things and not be as careful because they are self-regulating, right? And so that's where we've been since 1997. We've been in this like corporations can choose to self-affirm into these generally recognized as safe, and this is not all additives, by the way. Like for example, color additives like red dye 40, yellow 1 or yellow 5, blue 1, all of those can't be generally recognized as safe. Alternative sweeteners can't be generally recognized as safe, like aspartame, and those have to go through FDA. But some ingredients can, and many have been. So what RFK Jr. has said that he wants to do, which is in line with what public health experts, for the vast majority of public health experts, have been wanting for decades, since this happened, really, is to stop that. They're calling it a loophole, or is to stop that self-affirmation process from happening, so that all additives have to go back through this FDA approval. The only problem with that is you need resources at the FDA to do that, right? Like I'm very pro closing the loophole, but you can't do that while you are cutting resources from the FDA and cutting a third of the food division at the FDA, the people who are actually going to have to be going through this process to affirm these GRAS substances. So that's essentially what it is. I think that it's a good idea, but I think that it's way more nuanced than it's being made out to be.
I mean, it's so interesting because basically what you're describing is he's interested in creating, I mean, essentially more
More
regulations
regulation.
for big food. And it's the opposite of the direction of the rest of the Trump administration when they're trying to slash government, slash oversight, slash regulations for business. So I'll say this as the political reporter. This is one of the areas where you see the different Trump factions sort of at odds, and you wonder at some point there'll be a clash. So I'm curious. Well, let's do quickly, and we can maybe do another conversation about this one. But one of their main central contentions is that Europe has a better system for regulating what's in food, and that we should aspire to be more like the rules in Europe. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, so that's I agree to a certain extent. So I am personally of the mindset that I like the idea of a more precautionary approach to food additives. That's my personal perspective. I think that, so there's a couple of layers there. So Europe, they don't have this like self-affirmation GRAS system, right? So I'm very pro like, let's take a page from their book and like make everything go through FDA approval, right? Like they have oversight on everything and they're regularly like doing safety updates on everything. The biggest difference with us in Europe, though, when we do these evaluations of food additives, is we tend to take what we term a risk-based approach, where Europe takes more of a precautionary approach or a hazard-based approach. And the best way I can explain that is kind of thinking of a shark in the water. A shark in the water would be a hazard, right? And so if there's a potential for issues, the precautionary idea is to take take those food additives out. Now there's more to it than that. If people really like, if they're used in foods that people in Europe really like they're going to be more lenient. But for the most part, that's what they do. Where we take a risk-based approach. So we say, okay, there's a shark in the water, but is there a person next to the shark? And is that shark aggressive? And how close is it? And what is the likelihood of an attack? And so that's what we look at. So when you think of food additives, what we do is we see the food additive and we say, okay, well, what dose are we talking about? What dose are people exposed to? Is there any harm at that particular dose? And honestly, the risk-based perspective is the more evidence-based perspective, looking at dose, right? Because everything at any chemical out there, including water, at a certain dose is going to be hazardous or harmful to health. And so thinking of it from a risk-based approach is the more evidence-based approach. But I do think that we definitely should, again, personal perspective, close this kind of grass loophole and ensure that we're doing these regular safety updates on all of these additives, like Europe.
So it sounds to me like there are areas in which you think that RFK's critique of our food system is quite accurate and backed up by science, and that he is proposing reforms that make some sense. And then there are these areas where, like seed oils, where it's just not based on science and they're making claims that just aren't backed up by science. And I'm curious if you have a way of understanding sort of the appeal of a lot of what he's doing. When he says that certain artificial dyes cause cancer and ADHD without any evidence, or when MAHA says like your cereal's killing you. What is this idea of an appeal to nature, and what's the strategy here?
Yeah, so I will say I agree with you. There are some things that I do agree with RFK Jr. on, because I am somebody who wants to see our population healthy and I want to see our food supply healthy. And so some of the things that he says I do agree with. What I don't agree with is the approach of it and the distraction of using these food additives. Because we're talking about food additives, but when we think of them in the context of public health, there are just so many other more important things to talk about. So we can talk about those, but when you're only talking about those and literally not talking about all of the other things that have to do with public health, you're not talking about food insecurity, your food deserts, you're not talking about healthcare access, you're not talking about the food environment in terms of making it more accessible to people. You're not talking about just all of the other barriers, the built environment, all of what we term in public health social determinants of health. It's very glaringly obvious that they're not serious about public health. And that's my biggest problem with the movement is if they were talking about all of those things and talking about revising these food additives, or really like looking taking a look at these food additives, and improving kind of our regulatory process, that's a totally different story. But what is being done is that they're being used as this distraction, so that the administration that they've aligned with is now gutting all of these other programs, these public health programs. And so when I look at that and I'm like, but swapping red dye 40 for carmine or beet juice and Skittles is not going to make an impact on our health, especially when you're taking food assistance away from low income populations. And so I think that's kind of the bigger picture of this MAHA movement and where they miss the mark versus just what I agree versus disagree with about food additives, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. Can you repeat for us what you think are among the most important priorities in food public health? You said food deserts. What are the things you wish you were focused on instead?
Yeah, so I think expanding nutrition assistance and healthcare access to people. I mean, just think about public health for a second, and we're talking about chronic disease prevention. When you think about the individuals in this country who are most impacted by chronic disease, they're not the people buying $130 colostrum supplements. They're not the people, they're just not, right? They're low income populations in this country. So they're people who, I mean, 13.5% of this country live in food insecure households, including 1 in 5 children. And a food insecure household means that you don't always have access to the nutrients that you need to meet your needs. And so expanding food access, really investing in programs like SNAP and investing in programs like Double Up Bucks, which are these incentive programs to help them, gain access to more fruits and vegetables. Because if you want to improve public health, you have to target the populations that are most negatively impacted by public health. And there's research to show that there's a 15-year life expectancy age gap between the highest and lowest income populations in this country for men, and a 10-year life expectancy age gap for women. And so that's where you really need to be targeting. We need to be bringing in local food systems, incentivizing grocery stores to go into these food deserts, so that people, have access to food. Revising, as we talked about, revising. What are they called? Subsidies, so that we can make fruits and vegetables more affordable. There's just a number of actual things that you can do from a food perspective. Also with school nutrition, right? Like investing in school nutrition, investing in nutrition education at an early age, so that there's more demand for these nutrient dense foods, because corporations are going to create what is demanded, right? At the end of the day, and so educating from a early on age can be really helpful as well. And then you talk about all the other aspects of public health, right? There's also physical activity, there's also stress, there's also like housing and cities. And are your cities walkable and bikeable? Because that's going to increase the amount of physical activity that you get. Because, the average American walks, I think it's like 3,000 steps a day, which is woefully not enough. And a big reason for that is that we have a country that's really built for cars. You go over to Europe, they're walking a lot, right? Just
Yeah.
incidental physical activity, and we don't really have that.
There's a lot we could stand to fix. You're amazing. Thank you for your sharing your knowledge and your information. I have one more question, but before we do that, I just want to make sure everybody knows where to find you. You're on Instagram at
I am.
Jessica Knurick,
Dr. Jessica Knurick.
Dr. Jessica Knurick. And
Yeah.
what's your Substack called?
I think it's just called my name.
Okay, good.
I don't
So
really have
people,
a cool name like you do.
that's okay. We can work on it.
Yeah.
I also think your name is cool.
Yeah.
So folks can sign up for your Substack, your newsletter here, and follow you on Instagram. I would love to have another chance to talk to you as RFK does more, and we can follow up on this. And if folks have questions, write them in, and we can do a follow up conversation if you're amenable.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so I just want to, we covered so much ground and people probably have a lot spinning in their heads. Can you sort of wrap us up with like, what are some key takeaways? And are there is there a resource you would suggest people check out or an action step they can take to make sure that they're on top of what's going to keep them healthy and their families healthy?
Yeah, I hear from a lot of people like they just, they're at a loss of what to do and right now. And I think at the end of the day, in terms of health, there's a lot of chatter on social media and it can be very overwhelming. People telling you to not eat seed oils, and now I'm telling you seed oils are okay, right? Like there's a lot of just like chatter out there. But at the end of the day, like nutrition has not changed in decades, right? The basis of like good nutrition. Like some of the little things have changed, but like overall eating as many whole foods as you can. This is me preaching individual health right now versus public health, right? On an individual level, eat the rainbow, try to get in fiber. 90% of Americans are needing enough fiber. So work to get in fiber throughout the day, and you're going to do that through vegetables and beans and whole grains and things like that. And then if you're eating like these ultra processed packaged foods sparingly, which is not possible for everybody in this country, but if it is possible for you, you don't really have to worry about a lot if you're eating them sparingly, right? Like I don't really even look at like what is in the ultra processed food that I'm eating because I eat it so sparingly. Try to move your body, right? Like drink water, try to get outside and touch grass every day.
Totally.
And those are like the basic tenets of health. It's not as complicated as I think that social media and online can really make it seem. So I would say just kind of like go back to basics in terms of your individual health, and then from just a perspective in terms of like all of the stuff that's going on right now, because there's a lot with science that we didn't even get into, like attacks on science right now and public health. There's an app called Five Calls that I'm a huge fan of, and you can download that, and it shows you your senators and your representatives, and they even give you scripts like if you want, like funding is being taken away for nutrition assistance, they'll give you a script to like call your representative and tell them that that's not okay for you. And I think that if we all make our voices heard a little bit more, then that can make a big difference.
Well, Jessica, I am so grateful to you for your time today and for the time you take to share your wealth of knowledge with us and for hearing people and their concerns.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to everybody, I'll post this and send this out as an email so that you can share it with your friends. You know where to follow her and write in with any questions so we can do another conversation that responds to what's on your mind. Cool. See everyone soon. Bye bye.
Bye.